all for coming back. Again, I'm the same person from the morning session. Still Jenifer Bratter, still Associate Professor of Sociology. And what we'll be talking about today is kind of extending some of the discussion that we had this morning on challenges and barriers to sort of talk about race in the classroom, specifically with references to the social sciences. So the title of this talk, Does Race Exist? Legitimizing Race in the Social Sciences, actually comes from an interesting survey that we conducted in kind of preparation for this event. So as we've talked about, there's a lot of different conversational barriers that we sort of encounter when we're teaching sociology, anthropology, political science, or even psychology classes that sort of focus on race. And the reason why we wanted to sort of engage this discussion is a discipline-specific approach. So we have the component session on humanities, and here we're talking about the social sciences, is because what I wanted to talk about today is sort of what are the challenges in introducing race as a social construction, therefore not essential, not physical, not biological, but still real. And so that's kind of the broader kind of theme of this session is how do we, as social scientists, integrate kind of race as a social construction into our classes, and kind of what are the challenges we face, and also what are some solutions that we can collectively come up with. So as I said in the beginning, in preparation for this event, we conducted a survey among students in one of the colleges, Weiss College, where we asked them some basic information about their background, and then asked them if they'd taken any courses that focused on race, what they thought about those courses, how comfortable, how did they feel when they were taking those classes, and how important they felt race was to sort of cover in the undergraduate classroom in general. And while the majority, kind of the slight majority of the students regarded race as something that's important to cover within the undergraduate classroom, I felt like we could learn a lot from the responses of students who felt that it was kind of unimportant or sort of not necessarily legitimate to cover in the classroom. And so when we look at those responses, kind of three key themes emerge. So I'm going to just show you some of those. First is that it was just irrelevant. So these are three kind of representative quotes. I don't feel it's very important unless you're taking a class which is pertinent. And actually that was a very resonant thing. A lot of students were like, unless it's a class that matters in, you really shouldn't talk about it. Like this next quote. When it is relevant to the topic, it's important to be directly addressed. If it's tangential, there is a danger that it would seem forced and I get turned off. And then we have the just does race exist as a sort of another sort of representative quote. So in terms of sort of what are some barriers for students in sort of talking about race, there are sort of a kind of body of students who think that this is just an unimportant or irrelevant topic to even to cover. The other sort of way that students frame the unimportance of race is, aren't we equal? Like basically talking about race is in some ways perceived as counter to a discussion, counter to sort of a kind of a general social equality. So it's really not important, we are all equal, therefore perhaps we should teach equality, I guess, instead of race. Another quote, I think as long as everyone understands all ethnicities are equal and individuals are not defined by their race, and then there is no need for race to be addressed in the classroom. Sometimes the discussion or even the celebration of race only distances members from a multiracial community, which we are all a part of. Personally, I don't think race, class, or gender should matter to anyone, ever, in any setting. Yes, just should not matter. And as a sociology major, hey, it's data, it's cool. That is difficult belief to have, as it essentially against everything we discuss in classes. Yes, my belief stands on the basis that people are people. Love is love, and it shouldn't matter what someone looks like or how they're born, only their inner quality that should be of value. Okay, so we have the first one, which was just basically it's irrelevant unless the discipline covers it, and then we have this sort of aren't we equal sort of discussion. So I just want your reactions to this in terms of like how common do you think these types of perceptions are in your own teaching experiences, either as students in the classroom or as professors or graduate students or what have you? Do you think this is kind of representative of how students sort of perceive the topic?
Yeah, I think it is. Not only students, but among faculty. I have a friend who's got a PhD in history, and he's also a lawyer. He tells me race doesn't exist, and we would only stop talking about it, those issues would go away. My comeback is, so if we stop talking about cancer, cancer will disappear?
I love that. You should all use that. Other thoughts? I mean, do you ever confront this type of attitude in classrooms?
It's kind of an idealism that people want it to be true, and I think in the space of the classroom where we as teachers tend to try to create an egalitarian environment,
right.
It's almost wishing it into being.
Right,
So.
right, good.
I'm sorry. When I teach race in anthropology, I always have students write responses to either the written material or to the films, and those are not publicly posted. And so I feel like one section I specifically ask for their personal response, the personal critique of the material. And I do get a fair amount of, I think I do get a fair amount of this, and also some reinforcement of very sort of historic racial constructions that are being believed by students.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Well, I think that I'm seeing both. I get some students who are who write about feeling enlightened by the material,
right.
But I get a lot of students who respond in a fashion that indicates that it's not very relevant, that it doesn't really matter, that we've progressed too far to be addressing the topic, and basically I feel as though sometimes the material I've presented or have them read or view is not really being digested.
Okay, so then there's a question of, are they even kind of comprehending what you're putting out there?
I have similar questions related to gender and feminism.
Good.
And the students, they look so similar, and the students very much see feminism parts of the kind of post-feminist, like post-racial. And the thing that looks like you have a little bit of that I have with the gender question is that if you talk about gender, you are perpetuating inequality,
right.
not equality. Like they take some of the lessons they learn about equality and they misapply it. So if you look at race, if you look at gender, you're the one that is perpetuating inequalities.
Even as the instructor, as the professor, then you're the problem.
Well, the class does that.
The class
inappropriately. Like if we didn't talk about it, if we didn't have to have a class on race or gender, everything would stay almost.
Right, right. Yes.
I want to piggyback on what Brian said, that it's kind of that idealistic view of a perfect world. But then when you put it to, do we live in that kind of world?
Right.
No, we don't. We don't live in a world where everything's okay, where everyone's equal, where there is no discrimination. So in that sense, then, personally, I don't think race, class, and gender should matter. It does matter.
Right.
And so then they come around to that once you bring it to, is that the world you live in right now? What about your neighborhood? What about your family?
And we can talk about that. So what do the students do with the evidence, even as you're presenting to the class?
I think that sociology as a discipline is very liberal normative, and it can be very uncomfortable for a student to speak up and say that it does matter, because it is much more politically correct to say, we are all equal, love is love, people are people.
And I don't think there's any classes that say love isn't love. People really aren't equal. And, people are unequal, essentially. But I think it's interesting that saying that race matters is equated with saying that racism is okay, I think is the thing that kind of doesn't necessarily translate. But you're right, like, love is love means that we shouldn't talk about this. Yes?
Hi, I teach intro to gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender studies at UH. And we talk a lot about the intersectionality of race and socioeconomic status and all of that. And what I gather from my students is that they all understand content like racism is bad, but they don't really know the implications of why exactly. But everyone knows you shouldn't feel a certain way about race, but they don't really get the implications of it to like unpack everything, and then their minds would blow and they're really sad. So,
And that's what we want to talk about, how to make more people sad. Yes.
What kind of jumps out at me is that it all boils down to sort of a individualist behavior. It's a behavior.
Right. Right.
Without any other kind of implications that it's structural, it's embedded in all of our institutional relations. It's just, if you quit thinking that race is race, then it would go away. It's a very individualist, maybe American individualist perspective.
But it does say something about the level of analysis that's happening to the student, that race is something beyond individual isn't translating, that it's all about kind of person to person. If I like you, you like me, then we're good, and why are we talking about this?
One thing, I mean, it's your data, so maybe you could tell us better, but going on with what Brian said, it seems the one in the middle is a little bit different, saying we don't even need it in the classroom, whereas I read the other two as a little more kind of, this is the ideal and wouldn't it be great if we're getting there. And I feel like, this is just an opinion, I'd love to hear more about your data, that the middle one, people say race is important, we don't need it in the classroom. I think in my sociology classes here at Rice, that's sort of 10%, or it's a small group. But what's a frequent group is a lot of people who say racism is sure a whole lot less now. We may not be completely post-racial, but we seem to be headed in that direction. It's kind of the general sense of like, we had the civil rights movement, right? We've had gains, right? Where things are much, much better is where I think a lot of students start off.
So you're saying the one in the middle is kind of the minority opinion in terms of it should not be addressed, but generally because we're on this path to progress, that's why we can be people, we can sort of see things as individualized because we've addressed all the bad structural stuff.
I think, yeah, going with what David said, yeah, there's a lot of, like, thinking of racism still is very individualized, and even if they will admit a structural, or do admit a structural component, it's still so much less. Like, to me, the starting point is it's a lot better than it used to be 40 years ago.
Right, right. Yes.
Well, I think that you know, one of the things that I noticed that I see in my students is this sort of generalization of an America that is a certain way without really, you know, and to me it kind of translates as not really invested or interested in the question. So I think that the whole issue of even anybody more than 10% saying that we shouldn't talk about race is part of this post-racial discourse where you can't say things like that, you know, where you can't say that there isn't racism, you know, you can't say that, you know, you can say I'm not racist, but you can say I know people that are racist, you know, and then they're out there. So for me, the difficulty I've seen is I teach anthropology and have been teaching some history courses has been just being able to get students to see it through their own experiences. So we get them out of the general and invest in their own lived experience and how that manifests itself. But it's kind of what you were talking about, or you mentioned, what does your neighborhood look like? And what do your friends look like?
Right, right. And kind of seeing that as data that they can sort of think, oh, this is race too. Yes.
My background is in the health field. I wonder if you have the opportunity of making this question in other fields beyond the social anthropology, or because we were having a conversation outside, and somehow I think that the audience pretty much is in fields related, so where the type of responses could be pretty much what you are getting.
Yeah.
But I wonder what would be the answers if you ask that in a dentistry classroom.
You know, you were setting me up so well. It's like, well, let's go see. Because the last thing, and this is for real, is that it's not a hard science. So we had several students who were from kind of the STEM field, chemistry, engineering, who referenced that as this is really irrelevant in sort of strict ways, like a bit irrelevant given my major. Like I do not care. I'm from chemistry. Important, but sometimes may seem irrelevant in classes that specialize in natural sciences or engineering. Not as much only because I'm in math and science classes, which are fairly unbiased. In physics and math, race is totally irrelevant and inappropriate. So don't even try to raise it, like you're saying, you know, this sort of needing to manage the discourse. It's not just that it's irrelevant, but if you even bring it up, that's like as a crime. And so for me, this kind of signals not just how students are thinking about race, but also how they regard the evidence that exists. You know, and that because race is, again, quote unquote, not a hard science, it sort of raises this question of how do we, as instructors, as professors, kind of present them with tools of analysis that can help them see that not only does race exist, even though it's a social construct, but that it's not just about an interaction that might be hurtful to a person, and then, okay, if that interaction doesn't happen, then it goes away. So what we're going to talk about a little bit today is sort of the ways in which we can give students tools to sort of think about race and think about the evidence of race. So I think, you know, when kind of reflecting on this, I feel like there's sort of two broader goals that sort of in any kind of conversation, instructional conversation on race. And the first is to give students the tools to understand how race, and I really mean it, how race is created through social interaction. So this is the larger charge of how do we sort of talk about race as a social construction, again, created through interactions that are happening at the micro level and the macro level. And then the second is to demonstrate how these creations, however they occur, matter to individual lives. So yes, race is socially constructed, but then the next step is the implications. And again, the hope is again to emerge both within any class so that we understand that not only is race something that is socially constructed, but given that it has such broad implications, we also have the power to deconstruct it. We also have the power to basically take away its legitimacy. Since we are the ones who are feeding it, can we then change it? So I wanted to start by with us kind of thinking about this first goal, to give students the tools and how race occurs through interaction, by looking at a YouTube video that is based on this series. I don't know if you've seen it, ABC News, What Would You Do? Okay, so we're going to talk about that one. And I want you to talk about how, what would we do to manage the reactions if this were presented in class?
A candid camera of ethics, a sort of lab experiment that can have unexpected results. Here's John Quinones.
Three teenage boys looking for trouble, big trouble.
Looks like you overshot the trash can, Zach.
Within moments, they surround someone's car, and they're trying to break in.
You break in? I think I almost got it, dude. You almost got it?
Yeah. And now they spray paint the car with graffiti. This man who's driving by has seen enough.
Hey, cut your car? What? Is that your car? You can. You're up somebody else's car? I guess I'll call the police then.
A friend of the man arrives and makes the call to 911.
The cops will take care of you.
Okay.
It's a nice movie facility for you guys.
Yeah.
You'll love it. 3 squares a day, buddy.
But the police are not coming, and these teenage vandals are not going to jail. They're actors. The car and the hidden cameras belong to us. We wanted to know if anyone would step in and try to stop a blatant act of vandalism in a suburban parking lot. But as you'll see, before our experiment is over, we'll get a lesson in human nature we could never have predicted. Our teenage vandals are loud and pretty brazen in broad daylight, yet people continue to walk right by. Do they think the boys are trashing their own car? Well, even when it becomes clear the car is not the boys, many keep right on going.
I hope that's your car.
Yeah, I'm spray painting my own car.
You being sarcastic?
Yeah.
This woman seems to be almost joking with the boys. Almost.
Don't do mine, please. I can't do it. Please, don't do mine.
I promise I won't do yours.
The women keep on walking. Later they told us they would have called the police. And how about this woman? Will she step up? She looks concerned. She's soon joined by another woman. They stop, speak, but keep going. She says getting involved isn't worth the aggravation.
I have to say, there's times where I have been a witness to things and I've had to take off work and go to court.
I was horrified, but we did keep walking. I should have done something.
This woman keeps an eye on the scene from a safe distance, but we'll come back to her later. Our vandals, meanwhile, have been at it for nearly 3 hours, destroying that car and seldom being challenged. But they'll soon meet their match. This man, sprinting up the path, demands some answers.
Is it yours? Is it yours?
No.
So why don't you just mind your own business?
This is public business.
Public business? That's public business.
Taking somebody's vehicle, private property in public.
Let me show you how much I care, sir.
Adios. Have a nice day.
The boys, meanwhile, are undaunted.
Hope you enjoy your jog.
Something else you wish to say to me?
Something else you wish to say?
No, I'm sorry. You're the one that keeps talking as I'm walking away. You got a problem?
Do you have a problem?
Yeah, I do. I hate folks that talk to me behind my back.
Why don't you just...
I'm on my own business, but shut up.
All right. Why don't you just take...
Shut up.
Oh, okay.
Sir, hi. I'm John Quinones. We're with ABC News.
When we introduce ourselves to Brian Jakes, he's still pretty steamed at the boys and at us. While he calms down, we talk to his wife, Dawn, who had walked by the boys earlier.
I was keeping an eye on him. I was waiting for my husband to come back, because I wasn't going to confront 3 boys by myself.
Brian has cooled off now, and he says he was just acting on a lesson his father taught him.
You can't turn your blind eye or deaf ear. Somebody's in trouble.
It wasn't your property.
No, you're right, it wasn't. But, you know, it was somebody's. You know what? We're all in this together.
He took action in a way that was selfless, and it was about stopping something bad from happening.
Jack DeVidio, Professor of Psychology at Yale University.
He made a difference. I don't think it was a smart thing to do, necessarily, but I think it was a good thing and the right thing to do.
Dangerous?
Dangerous. That's why most people will walk by.
Indeed, our vandals have been at it for most of the morning, viciously destroying someone else's car. Dozens of people have walked by, yet only a handful have challenged them. But we're about to discover that if this kind of vandalism in broad daylight doesn't get much attention, something else does, something we could have never imagined. Remember, all that destruction by our vandals triggered just one 911 call. But it turns out 2 other calls were made to 911 from the same park.
911, where's the emergency?
In Richmond, New Jersey.
But those calls were about another car parked nearby.
A couple guys in the car laying down like they look like possibly they're getting ready to rob somebody.
Rob somebody? How does he know that? The caller hangs up, but a few moments later, he's back.
You got 3 black kids laying in the car, and there's a lot of little kids around. I'm just keeping an eye on them.
In fact, the young people in the car are just sleeping. They also just happen to be black.
Whether it's because of the media, because of history, we as Americans have an association of blacks with crime. Both blacks and whites have that association of blacks with crime.
It doesn't make sense. You call the cops on sleeping kids and not the vandals.
There's nothing rational. But if we have the associations of blacks with crime, we see what we expect. And even if they're sleeping, we can make that into a potential criminal act.
If that had been white kids sleeping,
then they'd be white kids sleeping.
But coming up, if a few African Americans resting in a car trigger calls to 911, what'll happen when we replace the white vandals with 3 black actors? Will that make a difference? When What Would You Do comes back.
Okay, so what kind of conversation could you have about that disparity in reactions? The kids sleeping in the car trigger 911 calls, the kids beating up the car trigger some funny banter in one 911 call, but most people just ignoring it. So what kind of conversation do you think we could have about, first of all, is race occurring in this? Like, let's say we're dealing with an intro class and you see this disparity, so like, what explains the difference in reactions? So like, what kind of conversation do you think we could have about that? Yes?
Before you showed the other part, I was thinking to myself,
all those people walking by, saying, oh, don't do my car, and all this. I said, if those were 3 black guys, they'd all be calling 911. And I didn't know you were going to show that other part.
Yeah.
But I was thinking to myself, yeah, if they were black, they'd all call. And then you should have said, oh, yeah, they're just sleeping, but you got people watching them. Sleeping. It's like, they committed a crime already, and they said, oh, they're going to rob somebody. Why do you think that? You know, because they're black.
So it should begin by asking kind of like, you know, so, you know, why, you know, not call, you know, just in the one sort of situation versus the other. And just begin by asking students why. Other thoughts? Other thoughts on history?
Well, I would raise the issue about arrest records and prisons. Who's more likely to be arrested, who's more likely to go to prison, and look at why.
And use this as a way to sort of explain why. Okay. So use this as a drop-off point, as a jumping-off point for me to not arrest correctly. For arrest records and prisons, good.
And also the implications once you're arrested and it's on your record, that continues to follow.
Right.
And look at these guys who were tearing up this car, they're not going to have that arrest record.
So the implications again go both ways. So like, you know, the implications for the white kids who are probably vandalizing other cars, and as well as for the black kids who aren't doing anything. Okay, there was another hand raised. Yes.
I would like to see the same.
Would you like to see it?
3 white kids in a Latino or a white neighborhood.
So then we can have a conversation about if we change the context.
It's the same.
Okay, so. And why would that matter?
What?
Yeah, I'm asking you, like, what do you, like, okay, let's just put this, like, if,
Let's space belong to.
Right, okay, good. So the other sort of element of this is that this is a predominantly white, if not entirely white space. And so then we can also ask students not just what are the races of the individuals, but what are the kind of, what is the race of the space having and how, what role does that play?
And just to piggyback on that, that can easily lead to getting beyond just a white-black binary and sort of bring in Asians, Latinos, all sorts of different groups, like get the discussion beyond just much more common, I think, or much more comfortable among a lot of students is white versus black, black versus white.
So if we put this into a predominantly Latino neighborhood, what would this look like? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and it could just be expanded, like you can just complicate race and sort of diversify the discussion.
I see.
I would probably ask a question about how fear is produced.
Good. Okay.
And what produces fear. So what is it about the images of these 3 white kids that don't produce fear versus these 3 black kids with hoodies, right? That become an image of fear.
And so kind of what's happening in terms of when we construct race, we're also constructing fear. Other thoughts?
Yeah, there's also the class marker going on with the kinds of cars involved. The one is an older car. It has cultural associations to it, as does the other, like champagne curvy car.
What?
Champagne colored curvy car.
Tell me about that. So the car had it coming because it was a low-ranked car?
The car being beaten up was a lower ranking looking car.
I see. So who cares about this car? Within the white scenario?
And then why would those 3 black kids be in such an expensive looking car?
There you go. So kind of class markers. And again, this is getting us beyond the individual racial identities of the kids involved, but so the various class markers. So the class marker of the car, the class assumption of the kids involved. Right.
might have been more interesting if they could have kept bringing in a new or an unmarked car. Because at some point it almost becomes, it's so extreme that it's comical that they almost covered the whole car. And so you look at this and you go, is this like a high school performance art thing? This is
Well, I have that idea because they're 3 white kids. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's like the moment that you see 3 black kids, you know, there is no performance about it, even as they walk up to the car. You think, you know, it's so...
Yeah, so I think maybe the experiment kind of lost its value once you reached 20 minutes in, and then they're just like painting over painting.
Well, it definitely suggests, the fact that it was allowed to go for that long, and there's the banter and stuff, that we're definitely constructing this in a way that is not criminal and not dangerous. So maybe it's, you know, this is performance art, or maybe I just like drawing on things, like cars, you know, that's what I'm into. Versus, you know, when they do it with black youth, there is no performance art assumption happening there. But I think you're right that the fact that it's allowed to go so long almost does sort of say that this is obviously not being constructed as something criminal at all.
Yeah, I was gonna, I guess, speak to that. I think this would be like a really good opening for a conversation about how crime is defined around race, or just like deviant behavior in general, but specifically like crime, or things that are defined as crime.
I like that. So how crime is defined around race and kind of how we either construct race through crime or how we construct crime through race. Sam.
Well, to respond to your point, if when they do it with black kids, if they do the exact same thing even all the way through, and then you test the performance art part of it for the white kids, with the performance art part of it with the black kids, you're still going to compare apples to apples. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I assume they do that.
They do. I could show you a little clip because I definitely have it up, and it's pretty stark because let's see, I'll let you be the judge.
What'll happen if we change the race of those vandals? And if this group could trigger 911 calls just by dozing in their car, what'll happen when we send these black teenagers out to do some real damage? As she walks by the vandals, this woman is already on her cell phone.
Yeah, I'm at the Ridgewood Vet Pond, and by the walking path there's a group of 1, 2, 3 kids.
And right on her heels, this man, cell phone in hand.
911, where's your emergency?
Yeah, hi, I'm over in Ridgewood at the Shaw River Park, Ridgewood Avenue.
Okay, people spray painting a car?
Yep.
All right, we got it ready. We'll send it off.
This woman asks the boys what they're up to.
Yo, no, we ain't doing nothing, man. Just having fun, man.
While maintaining a safe distance, she also calls 911.
And there's kids that are beating up on a car. How many kids? 3 kids. Black or white? They all 3 look like they're just black. Black males? Yep.
Are you gonna walk away like nothing happened?
The police will be here.
Huh?
The police are coming.
All 3 were angered by the vandalism, but wary of confrontation.
Teenagers are kind of unpredictable.
They seemed like they weren't afraid of being caught. I wasn't going to go especially right up to them because they had tools that could be used against me, and there's 3 of them and 1 of me.
The destruction continues, and it's clear that in this predominantly white suburb, our 3 African-American vandals are generating more interventions and more calls to 911 than the white vandals.
Neighbors pulling out the cell phones. One lady almost tripped, calling like, they're like, and I'm like,
they're here.
Hey, is that your car?
No? Is it yours?
No, but you shouldn't be doing that.
I felt outraged. How dare you come to our backyard and do something like that in the middle of the day in front of our kids? I don't care where you're from. I don't care what color you are. You're doing something illegal. And so immediately I decided to call the police.
Ridgewood Police, can I help you?
Yes, hi. There's actually 3 kids in the park, and they're vandalizing a car. They're actually painting the car, and they're trying to break in the door right now.
My husband was right to say that, what if those kids had a gun? And at that moment, honestly, I didn't think about that. The way I am, if I see something, I do something right away.
What I found fascinating
is that he's going to say it's fascinating that, well, I don't know exactly what he's going to say, but I want to know what you want to say. So when you look at this, what do you notice about the difference in reactions? I mean, there's the obvious cell phones are coming out right away, but again, how do we talk about this with students?
Well, I want to know who is being racist because it is a crime, so people should be calling the entire time. So who is being racist? The white people who don't see the whites as committing a crime, the whites who are calling out criminals for committing a crime.
So a question that could ask is like, you know, who is being racist? It's a very interesting question. Any reactions to that question? Yes.
Well, the reality is nobody's being racist, right? I mean, that's the kind of pretense behind this particular narrative, right? That these kids are essentially labeled the criminals over against like black kids, right? So the way that sort of there's a gap between how we talk about race and how we talk about criminality, and sort of what we see is people sit in the interstices between these two things and try to sort of overlap one with another, right? So they're still being racist. Like, I mean, I would hate to sort of skirt around that structurally. There is sort of this racist element to that, right? But they're personally, like, not volitionally being racist.
Well, I would add that this would take defining before we start saying, you know, so who is being racist, I think also always, at least in my experience, always requires a conversation about what do we define as racism.
True.
So I think that that's kind of an important component.
I was actually surprised at how the callers were leaving that out. They were not marked, you know, they were using their language to mark race. It was the 911 callers that were bringing that up. It may have been subconscious, but the callers themselves were using the terminology.
What in terms of identifying?
Hi, there's 3 black kids breaking into a car. Every one of them said there's 3 kids.
That's right.
So they could make themselves feel all right. So I'm not racist, I'm just calling in something. But I didn't do that for the white kids.
Yeah, I was wondering if it kind of encompasses all of this, but I would be curious to first put out the question, what is the social construction of this? Just to see what the kids identify as being the social elements. Of course, we've identified a lot of them, but I'd be curious to hear what factors would they bring in, just to understand, just in describing the social construction of what they just saw. You know, what,
you mean the kids in terms of the audience, in terms of
the students in the class? When you see this, what do you think socially created these types of responses?
So what are the people drawing from in terms of
yes. Yes.
Sam?
You know, just that question, who's being racist?
Yeah.
I think the question I would ask is, how is racism being expressed in the video? In the videos.
How is racism expressed? So, what do you mean by that?
Well, just at what points in the video, like this example is an example. This is an example of the expression of racism. The white people are going to. They've learned to be politically correct and not use the race identifier or signifier.
Right.
But inside of them is this subconscious whatever. The expression of racism leads them to react one way in one situation and another.
Well, I mean, we can also ask analytically, like, does it come through the comparison? So it's not just about the fact that, it's not so much that, you know, this act is racist because somebody's calling 911, but we get to gauge it through this kind of comparative analysis. But generally speaking, we don't have that comparison. So then what do we do with that?
I think my difficulty with the class with teaching these things at this particular historical moment is precisely your comment, is that students will see something like that and they will gravitate towards, they won't feel enraged at the obvious illustration of racism that's taking place, and instead they'll ask a question about who is being racist, what is criminality, in the end of the day, this is a criminal act. And that I have to, you know, to figure out how to break that down, because you don't have a Ku Klux Klan member that's burning some, you know, right? You don't have that, and so, you know, I see that video and immediately I'm, you know, already sort of shaking inside, you know, to see something like that, but my students don't have that reaction. And that to me is the particular difficulty of speaking about race in this moment, is that there are these examples, but it's almost like they're not being seen.
Right, right, yes.
And I think this is a really good example too, because you, I guess what you were saying about it not being racist that these people are calling 911 because that's actually a crime and it's actually wrong to just like harm someone else's property for whatever reason. But it is to give the benefit or the privilege to the white kids. Like that's kind of like where how the racism is expressed, because you're giving them the privilege of being okay, or like the benefit of the doubt that you're not like giving.
So it's not just the difference, but it's the difference that kind of always goes in this direction. Yeah. And so I think that's an interesting point, because you can draw from that and say, you know, it's not just about bias, it's about bias that, again, tends to ascribe advantage in a very specific way.
But I can blame it, that part, on a student not able to quickly get it, because what is the average of age that a student is 19 years of being bombarded by media, profiling certain groups. I mean, that's hard to break in just a 2-hour week class and say, hey, change your party, and now start thinking different. It's huge change from my point of view.
No, I think that's a very good point, and I think that, but it also, it provides sort of context for why this is so difficult, and sort of the uphill battle that you're sort of facing, but also that there's a lot to work with. Like, you've had 19 years of this education. Let's sort of understand it as an education that we can unpack.
Yeah, I guess a question. I don't know how to get beyond the point of responding to comments like, well, you know, it was criminal in all cases. Right. Everybody should have been calling 911. Even though I might point out, you know, one gets characterized as mischievous behavior for white kids, and the other gets characterized as being criminal behavior. And then the other resistance that I get to trying to get kids to absorb race in the classroom is when you use wonderfully, you know, visual examples. Particularly, I teach a lot of pre-meds, and so I get the science response. Well, that's just a case report. That's an anecdotal story. How do we really know? And then you try and maybe present some more evidence, but there's a discounting of narrative, and there's a discounting of experience, and a discounting. I mean, that was someone raised that, and I hadn't thought to mention that. But in the responses I get, invariably, when there's something I present, whether it's about race or anything else, that there's resistance to absorbing, it's that it was biased. So often qualitative work is being deemed biased by STEM people, for instance, or you know the hard science kids.
Well, I think one of the beauties of this is that it is an experiment in that way, and then you can at least insert that language to say, okay, you know, this is not just a study of a person going out and interviewing some folks on something that happened. This is like, conditions are the same, we have a control, we have a treatment. Right. And sometimes throwing that language back at this audience can be very effective. Yes. Oh.
I was just going to say the experimental nature of it. This is a great, I'm a social psychologist, so I first talk about the scientific method, which puts me in a lucky position. Because then I can show this and they can say, they do exactly what some of y'all have said. They said, well, it's a crime, criminals should be punished, doesn't matter what their race is. And then someone else says, yeah, but this is just one case. And then I say, okay, well, let's now look at the warehouse of experiments where you take the exact same behavior. The only difference is the racial makeup of the participants. And every single time, it's the people of color who are seen as criminals. And so it's a nice lead-in because they do want to dismiss the anecdotal nature of it, but then when you can turn it into science, there's no way to get around it. They're totally left with differential treatment based on race.
That's right. And I think that's also something important to highlight, because if you don't have that information, that doesn't mean race doesn't matter, but those are the sort of the barriers, particularly going outside of the discipline of either sociology or psychology.
Well, I
I did not see it as a good experiment because if you notice when they started with the second iteration, they said, what happens if we send 3 black kids in to do some real damage? So one, they framed it as real damage, the others were just playing. And then they are actually hitting the cars up, they're not just spray painting. So they really changed it in a very subtle way to kind of, to evoke the response that they were trying to get. So I find this a little problematic in this sense, but I can see how it would be wonderful to get students' attention. But I would want to follow this very quickly with something more along the lines of job applicants. Where you have something that, how it plays out, because the intersection between race and crime is already so embedded that it makes it a bit more complicated. Thank you very much.
Can I push back on that?
Yeah.
I think I think that's why this is so effective, because you're going to the heart of this and deep in people. And truthfully, the way they do it, you have to watch the whole episode, so I'd encourage you to do that. It's pretty, in spite of the fact that the narrator says that, which is cool that you point that out, I think the kids are doing essentially the same thing. And when you see the rate of differentiation rate in the responses is so vast that it's a unique opportunity to go at this crime and race issue. So yeah, I'm with you. Certainly, they're doing a television thing, and it kind of sucks, that they do this. They're playing into the racism right there. They're essentially telling the viewer, watch this, and so I think I like what you said. But
so actually, we're getting close to being out of time, or we're actually over time. But I wanted to close with the responses of students who did think teaching race was important as sort of a hopeful note that it's not just people who are combative. So these are 3 quotes from students who felt that race was important, and this is why. It's important for race to be addressed in the undergraduate classroom because it's everywhere in our daily lives. There needs to be a forum where race relations are discussed openly so that new perspectives can be heard and improve how we view other races. I believe it is very important. People are often too afraid, especially in the U.S., to discuss issues relating to race openly, and the classroom is the ideal environment for which to discuss it. It's important if you're a relatively homogenous area like me, where race was never really a factor, it's important to learn about how race has been a factor in laws, history, etc. And I want to close on this point because I think primarily, at least the feelings that I've gotten when I've taught race, is that I do focus a lot on what are the barriers. But I think this is a conversation that students are really yearning for, and that they're really welcome to if done in a way that I think kind of exposes all the stuff that we've sort of highlighted here. So thank you very much. We have like a 10-minute break, and then there's the next session. But thank you very much for coming. And this is